All right, good evening. Good evening. I am Gavin Bell, a student affairs practitioner and doctoral scholar here at NC State University. And a little bit about me, for the context of this talk, is that I'm also a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. The Lumbee Tribe is a group of about 60,000 in the southern part of the state, with our traditional homeland being in present-day Robeson, Scotland, and Hoke counties. We are a people of pride, if you can't tell, and we heavily center family, culture, and community in all that we do. And one thing that you learn very quickly, being around Native family, culture, and community, is that we as Native people are very descriptive with our words. We like to paint pictures not only in the stories that we tell and pass down, but also in our day-to-day interactions with those around us as well. And so in order to honor that, I want to first start this thing off by simply painting you all a picture. In this scene that we're painting, I want you to imagine a lake on a beautiful summer day with the sun rays hitting off of the water. And in the middle of that lake, there's a man fishing in his boat. Now you, as a fly on the wall to this scene that we're painting, are able to suddenly see that there are 4 holes forming in the bottom of that man's boat, and they're starting to take in water. It doesn't take long for the man to realize this as well, and he gets to work quickly trying to patch up the holes to ensure that his boat doesn't sink. And he works diligently to get that first hole patched up completely to perfection. No more water's coming into it. But when he looks at those other 3 holes, he pauses for a minute, he shrugs, and then he just continues to fish. Now you, as the fly on the wall to that scene, are probably finding the urge to say, "My man, what you doing? You might not be sinking as fast, but rest assured, if you don't patch up those other holes, you're still gonna sink." And the moral of that story, the lesson, seems very common sense. In order to avoid a sinking boat, we have to address all 4 areas equally. And even though that seems common, it's also a reality that when it comes to the infrastructure of our own personal well-being, many of us navigate in a very similar way. Instead of recognizing that we are multidimensional beings with different and unique areas that comprise our well-being, often we will hyperfocus into 1 to 2 areas that are perhaps most comfortable, most familiar, at the cost of neglecting other areas of our well-being that ought to be cared for as well. And even though we know in the back of our head that down the road, that's probably going to create a sinking boat effect, we will convince ourselves in the present moment that simply doing a laundry list of good things is the same as holding effective balance across those things. And y'all hear how I'm saying we, right? Because I'm a part of this collective as well. And there's been times both in my present and in my past where I've had to pause and think about my own well-being, my balance, or lack thereof. During the 2020 pandemic, for example, a time where I know many of us were feeling anxiety and apprehension, I convinced myself that if I poured in heavily to my physical well-being, that I would be good to go. If I worked out every day, if I went on runs, if I drank my water every day, I would be A-okay. And it did not take me long to realize that neglecting my emotional well-being, neglecting my mental health, my mental well-being, not being vulnerable with community, my communal well-being, was putting me on a very fast track to my own sinking boat. And what that period ultimately led me to was a time of self-reflection, self-reconciliation, and ultimately the pursuit of holistic well-being, addressing all the different areas that comprise who I am as an individual on this earth. And when you've had to do that work on yourself, when you've had to look at those areas that you've been neglecting, avoiding, it's very easy to look on somebody else's face and tell when they're going through the same thing. And at the time, I was working in university housing here at NC State with majority undergraduate students, and just by looking on their faces, I could tell that many of them were going through their own periods of reflection, reconciliation, and having to address their own imbalances. And in a desire to support my students while also continuing to hold myself accountable, I wanted to bring forth a framework that would, number 1, allow students to better visualize and define the different areas of their well-being, while number 2, being a framework that didn't just sound nice on paper. But rather, I wanted it to be a framework that would have practical, daily application, not just for them being students, but also for them being human beings on this earth. I wanted it to be a framework that they could take into every stage of their life, far beyond NC State University. And as I was thinking about what type of framework could accomplish these things, I found myself often thinking about my Native identity. Because like I said, we as Native people are very descriptive with our words. Many of our approaches help to paint pictures in one's mind, and that's part of the reason our oral traditions get passed down so well in the first place. And in particular, when it comes to our approaches around healing and well-being, not only are they very visual in nature, but they are also very circular in nature. representing this idea that healing is a holistic endeavor that we are constantly engaging in throughout our lifetime up until we transition out of this earth. And one native framework that I think does a phenomenal job of representing that concept is the medicine wheel. The medicine wheel is a framework comprised of 4 interconnected quadrants that ultimately come together to make a whole. And this is something that's been used by many tribal communities since time immemorial across this nation. And depending on what specific tribal culture you're referencing, there's going to be different interpretations associated with this wheel. For some, this wheel can represent the stages of one's life, with white being your birth to your adolescence, adulthood, ultimately transitioning you into eldership and into the next life, aka the circle of life. For others, they view the quadrants similar to cardinal directions, like a compass, with each direction holding a particular set of wisdoms and values that one ought to engage in throughout their lifetime. And then, there's also the interpretation that the medicine wheel can be a better way to understand the self, with one area being your physical, then your spiritual, your emotional, and then your mental. And I thought that interpretation in particular was very helpful for my students. And so what I would have them do very practically, when they would come into my office to hang out for their one-on-ones, I would, on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, have them draw out their own medicine wheel with their 4 quadrants. And I would have them label those quadrants: physical well-being, spiritual well-being, emotional well-being. And instead of just simply saying mental well-being, I would have them take it a step further and say communal well-being. Because in particular, when we look at the research on undergraduate students, one of the main factors contributing to their success, their retention, their mental health is community and sense of belonging. And so for that 4th quadrant, I'd like for them to think about how are they pouring into community, but more importantly, how are they allowing community to also pour into them? And so when you have those, I basically have my students sit there and I have them reflect on the past week and how they've engaged in each of these areas. But there's also a reality with that reflection that many of these areas, many of these labels, physical well-being and spiritual well-being, for example, already have a lot of schemas, stereotypes, associations, definitions on what those things must mean. And so what I like to do is we go through each individual quadrant. I like to give students context on what these areas can and should represent, regardless of stereotypes and regardless of differentials in one's beliefs and personal backgrounds. For physical, for example, this is beyond just a stereotype of are you going to the gym for 5 hours a day and going on a 2-mile run every morning. I'm also thinking about our baseline physical needs that we can engage with practically even during our most chaotic days. Number 1, are you drinking your water consistently throughout the day? Not just once in the morning or once at night. I make this very practical for my students. If you are not peeing, urinating on the hour, every hour, clearly, you are more than likely dehydrated. And we cannot expect our bodies to navigate at peak capacity if we are not taking care of that baseline physical need. Another example is breathing, something that we often take for granted as well, in particular, deep breathing. During periods that feel chaotic, how are we taking time to deep breathe as a way to re-regulate our physical system? 4 seconds in through our nose, 4 seconds out through the mouth. Another example that often doesn't get associated with physical well-being at all is laughing. How often are you laughing? Because that's a very healthy physical release, and it burns some calories if that's what you're into. I made that one very practical for my students as well. I asked them during that past week, how often are you going into spaces where you're showing some teeth, genuinely smiling, laughing, because that's a baseline that we all need, and I think everybody could agree on that. Going down to spiritual, it's a reality that one's going to look different for different people. There's going to be different orientations. For some folks, they're going to orient up, God, creator, divine nature. For others, they're going to orient out to their environment. Now, that could be getting out in nature as a way to spiritually reconnect. That could also just simply be going into spaces where you feel spiritually warm and safe. I currently work in multicultural student affairs here at NC State. It's a student center. And many of our students say that they come into the space on a daily basis because they feel warm, safe, and cared for. That's also an example of orienting into your environment spiritually. And then that third orientation is an internal endeavor. In other words, what are those passions, those hobbies, those things that ignite your inner spirit and just get you excited? Those things where you could be doing it for 5 hours, but it only feels like it's been 5 minutes. During periods of chaos, how often are we able to engage in those things as a way to recenter ourselves? And to that point, regardless of what orientation you use, or if you use an iteration of all 3 of those, how are we first orienting to the present moment? Because in order to be spiritually well, we have to be in the present. Not swinging our pendulum forward into anxiety and apprehension, aka the future. And not swinging our pendulum into the past in regret and guilt. But ultimately, how are we oriented to the present, the ground underneath us? Going to our emotional, this is just very simply, how are we dealing with our emotions proactively versus reactively? Because it's a reality, as human beings on this earth, we are designed to feel the full spectrum of emotions. But often because of personal identity, societal norms, cultural expectations, we'll suppress different emotions, we'll push them down, hoping that they go away, but they never really go away. And over time, that creates a buildup. And over time, that buildup creates an explosion, what we call a Pompeii effect, where you're often blowing up at the wrong place, the wrong time, usually at the wrong person, and often with the wrong words being used. And so I like to tell my students, even if it feels uncomfortable, how are we engaging proactively to where we can avoid that Pompeii effect? And it's true. Dealing with certain emotions like grief, anger, sadness, anxiety proactively does not always feel comfortable. But let me also tell you this. If you let it build up into a Pompeii effect and you're having to reconcile that Pompeii effect on the back end, I promise you that's not going to feel comfortable either. Going to our communal, like I said before, this is just very simply, who are you pouring into, but more importantly, who are you allowing to pour into your life? And I tell my students this off the bat. I don't care how introverted you are, everybody is designed to have some level of community on this earth. But it's also a reality that community should be navigated similar to an onion, where you have your outer layers and you have your inner layers. And those outer layers are not bad. Those are people like your advisors and teachers that can give you guidance, support, but they're not going to know all the deep, intimate parts of your life. And a lot of times it may not even be appropriate for them to know those things. But even though vulnerability is hard, you do have to have one or two people that know you deep enough, well enough to where they can give you truth, accountability, and love when you can't give it to your own self. And the art of that communal well-being is navigating all those different layers and as best as you can, assigning people to the proper layer and then therefore the proper expectation of those people. Now, when we zoom out, I want to reiterate one of the core tenets of the medicine wheel is that all these quadrants are interconnected. In other words, deep breathing in your physical is going to allow you to orient better to the present moment in your spiritual. Orienting better to the present moment is going to allow you to have more clarity on what emotions you actually need to deal with. And then we all know this one. Dealing with your emotions proactively is more than likely going to help every single layer of your community. And then hopefully out of all those layers, one or two of them got some jokes. And they make you laugh a little bit, bringing us back to physical, quite literally full circle. But beyond that interconnectedness, I want to highlight the second tenet, which is balance across all these areas is of the utmost importance. When my students are filling out their wheels, for example, if somebody has 8 bullet points in their physical, but only 1 bullet point in their emotional, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything wrong, but that is an imbalance that we can gently account for the following week. And in that pursuit of balance, I also want to be clear, we are human beings, and that balance is not always going to look perfect week to week, let alone day to day, let alone hour to hour for most of us in this room. And that is okay. In that pursuit of balance, the baseline has to be grace and compassion for ourselves. Not beating ourselves over the head every single time we feel like we're falling out of step with what we ought to be doing. And with that being said, I want to leave you with this. The medicine wheel, as is with many Indigenous frameworks, is not engaged with solely for the motive of personal fulfillment, just to make you feel good and that's it. But rather, all of our frameworks emphasize interrelatedness and interconnectedness with one another, meaning that as you extend grace and compassion and balance to yourself, you are going to more authentically be able to do that for the community around you. Your friends, your family, your workplaces, your own villages of people. And that ultimately has to be what all of this here is about. Because it's a reality in our society right now, things are tense. There's a lot of polarization. There's a lot of anger, fear, anxiety around every corner, it seems. And all of that is situated within a cultural context, particularly in the United States, that is hyper-individualistic. And so as we think about moving forward as a society, we have to understand that moving forward means moving forward in tandem with one another. But let's be clear about something. You're not about to be able to move forward in tandem with anyone. You're not going to be able to extend grace, compassion, accountability to anyone if you have not first done so for yourself. And when we are all able to come to the table from places of self-regulation, self-composure, and balance, that's when we as a collective, as a society, are able to start doing the good work of grace, compassion, accountability, healthy challenging, and ultimately healing. The healing that good medicine can provide for us all. Thank you.